Imagine palaces glittering with diamonds while, only a few blocks away, families huddled together in windowless tenements, shivering through winters and suffocating through summers. Imagine banquets where swans were served on silver platters, while across town, children dug through garbage for scraps of bread. This was the Gilded Age, a time when America's wealth gleamed so brightly it blinded the world, while beneath the gold leaf was a layer of rot and suffering. Tonight, we're going to walk both sides of that street. We'll step into the marble-clad ballrooms where heiresses danced under electric chandeliers, their gowns stitched with pearls, and their champagne flowing like water. And then, we'll slip quietly into the kitchens, the attics, the sweatshops, and the alleyways where servants and laborers lived lives of back-breaking work and endless exhaustion. It was a world of shocking contrast, where you might pass a carriage rolling down Fifth Avenue, a lady inside dripping in diamonds, only to turn the corner and see a family of 6 in a single tenement room, sleeping in shifts because there wasn't enough floor space for everyone at once. And yet, through the misery and the glamour, through the waste and the want, people endured. Some rose, some fell. And all left behind stories that remind us that inequality is never just numbers on a page. It's lived, it's felt, it's carried in tired shoulders and sleepless eyes. So, if you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, you're in the right place. Let this story carry you, and if you're still awake at the end, I'll be here to say goodnight. Picture yourself walking down Fifth Avenue around 1890. On one side, a dusty horse-drawn trolley creaks past, its wooden benches packed with working men in soot-stained jackets, women clutching baskets, and children who should probably be in school, but are instead hauling bundles of newspaper. And then, just a block away, there's a palace. Not a house, not a mansion, but an honest-to-goodness palace. It isn't just big, it's absurd. Columns, turrets, carved gargoyles, marble staircases wide enough to march a small army down. These weren't homes. They were monuments to ego, shrines to money, cathedrals where the gods being worshipped were named Vanderbilt, Astor, and Carnegie. The Vanderbilts, for example, had a talent for making other rich people feel poor. William Henry Billy Vanderbilt once built a set of side-by-side mansions so massive on Fifth Avenue that New Yorkers dubbed them the Triple Palace. Imagine calling something a palace with a straight face and then having to clarify which palace you meant, because there were multiple on one block. That was the scale of things. Inside, the decor wasn't exactly subtle. Gold leaf everywhere, silk wallpaper imported from France, stained glass windows by Tiffany, and staircases that seemed designed for one purpose only, to make every guest feel like Cinderella entering the ball, except instead of a prince at the top, there was usually a stuffed peacock or a Vanderbilt glaring at you for wearing last season's gown. And the parties, oh the parties. If you've ever thought weddings today were expensive, consider Alva Vanderbilt's infamous 1883 masquerade ball. It cost the modern equivalent of several $1,000,000 and involved 1,200 of New York's richest people stuffed into a mansion, dripping in jewels and feathers, pretending to be queens, shepherdesses, and Renaissance dukes. The press went wild for it, of course. Meanwhile, outside, actual children in rags pressed their noses against the carriage wheel, hoping for a coin to drop from the velvet purses swinging by. Food was another kind of spectacle. Banquets stretched for hours with courses upon courses. Turtle soup, roasted swans, lobster in aspic, entire peacocks cooked, painted, and served with their feathers reattached, because apparently dinner wasn't impressive unless it looked like it could fly off the platter. And the champagne, so much champagne, that waiters poured it into elaborate glass towers just to watch it spill from one level to another. Basically, it was a human version of Instagram flexing, only with more gout. The clothes were their own battlefield. Heiresses appeared in gowns embroidered with real gold thread, and some had dresses so heavy with pearls and jewels they could barely walk. Imagine wearing an outfit so expensive it doubles as a down payment on a Manhattan brownstone. Every stitch screamed, "Look at me, I can afford this." And society did look. Society noticed everything. Which jeweler you used, how many diamonds you wore to the opera, whether your tiara was Cartier or just, God forbid, Tiffany's. Now, the wealthy loved to call themselves America's aristocracy, but here's the kicker. They weren't really aristocrats. They were new money. Most of them had grandfathers who were dirt farmers, fur traders, or, let's be honest, ruthless businessmen who made fortunes by undercutting, bankrupting, and occasionally bribing their competition. Cornelius the Commodore Vanderbilt famously said, "What do I care about the law? Hain't I got the power?" A line so perfectly Gilded Age, it could be printed on their family crest. But because American society still sneered at new money, the Vanderbilts and their peers had to spend like lunatics to force their way into the elite social circle. They weren't just building houses, they were buying legitimacy one ballroom at a time. If the old money Astors threw a party with 12 courses, the Vanderbilts had 20. If the Astors wore diamond necklaces, the Vanderbilts wore diamond dog collars, literally, on their actual dogs. Yes, jewel-encrusted collars for pets, because why not? This competition reached ridiculous heights in Newport, Rhode Island, where the country's richest families built summer cottages. Now, if you hear cottage, you probably think of something cozy with maybe 2 bedrooms and a squeaky screen door. Not in Newport. In Newport, a cottage was the Breaker, Cornelius Vanderbilt II's 70-room Italian Renaissance-style palace overlooking the sea. It had a dining room larger than most New York tenement buildings. A single dinner in that room could feed 100 people, or more accurately, did feed 100 people, but only if you counted the guests in silk gowns and not the servants running back and forth with trays, collapsing from exhaustion. And here's the metaphor that sums it all up. The Gilded Age rich lived like they were in an endless episode of Keeping Up with the Carnegies. Every party, every house, every dress was a stunt to prove they were richer, shinier, and more sophisticated than the people across the street. Of course, beneath the marble and champagne was a fragile sort of panic. These families knew their status was built not on centuries of noble lineage, but on railroads, steel mills, and ruthless business tactics. Their wealth glittered, but it was also precarious. It needed to be displayed constantly, loudly, and extravagantly to feel real. And here's where the contrast really hits. Because while the chandeliers blazed in Fifth Avenue palaces, the gaslights flickered in tenements just a few streets away. While a Vanderbilt child played with a doll that cost as much as a servant's yearly wage, another child just blocks over carried buckets of coal at midnight. It was one city, one age, but 2 completely different universes. So, as you picture the polished silver and the glittering gowns of those marble palaces, remember, this was just one side of the story. Downstairs, out back, in the hidden attics and kitchens, life was a very different kind of reality show. If the Vanderbilt ballrooms were America's Versailles, then the scullery kitchen was its dungeon. And at the very bottom of this hierarchy, lower than the butler with his silver tray, lower than the lady's maid fussing with tiaras, lower even than the footman polishing doorknobs, stood the scullery maid. If high society was playing a grand orchestra, she was the one clanging cymbals in the basement, unseen, unthanked, and utterly essential. Imagine being a 14-year-old girl arriving in New York around 1890, clutching a small carpet bag because your family couldn't feed another mouth. You've been told that work in service is respectable. You'll have a roof over your head, steady meals, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to move up in the household ranks one day. Reality? You're about to become the unpaid intern of the Gilded Age, except instead of fetching coffee, you'll be scrubbing soot out of fireplaces at 5 in the morning. The scullery maid's day began before sunrise. While the lady of the house was still snoring under a mountain of imported French lace, The scullery maid was already knee-deep in yesterday's dishes. No dishwashers, no hot water on tap. Just her, a bucket, lye soap that burned her hands raw, and enough greasy pans to fill a small museum of cast iron. If she was lucky, she had another maid to help. If not, she scrubbed until her fingers blistered, then went straight on to scrub the floors, then the chamber pots, because someone had to deal with those, and you can guess who drew the short straw. Her quarters. Forget the gilded canopy beds upstairs. A scullery maid usually slept in an attic crawl space, if she had her own room at all. More often, she shared a narrow cot with another girl, the mattress stuffed with straw that poked through the ticking. Think of it as the Airbnb budget tier of the Gilded Age, except you couldn't leave a bad review. Her diet? Oh, she saw food all right. Roast ducks, soufflés, pyramids of fruit, endless rivers of champagne. But eating it, that was another story. Servants often survived on scraps, whatever was left after the family and the upper servants were done. It was like living inside a five-star restaurant, but being told to enjoy the smell instead of the meal. Bread crusts, thin broth, the occasional scrap of meat. If a guest had a smaller appetite than expected, she might sneak an apple or lick the spoon while no one was looking, but otherwise, her life was fueled by calories barely sufficient to keep her upright through 14-hour days. And the work never ended. Fires had to be lit in dozens of fireplaces, coal had to be lugged, brass had to be polished until it shone like a mirror. Dishes piled endlessly, kettles boiled, boots scrubbed. And the kitchen wasn't a cozy place with warm smells and bustling cheer. It was hot, smoky, and loud, with pots banging and cooks shouting. If she lagged, the housekeeper snapped. If she broke something, the wages she barely earned vanished. All the while, she was invisible. Upstairs, guests waltzed in silk gowns, clinking glasses under chandeliers. Downstairs, the scullery maid was hunched over a scrub brush, her only audience the rats in the cellar. It was a world of muffled footsteps above her head, laughter drifting down from the dining room, the sound of champagne corks popping somewhere she'd never been invited. And yet, despite all this, there was a strange kind of resilience. She learned to find pride in tiny victories, the shine of a perfectly polished floor, the rhythm of routines mastered, the secret camaraderie among servants who were all in the same boat. They swapped jokes in whispers, shared contraband biscuits, and stole moments of laughter when the mistress's back was turned. It was survival, but with sparks of humanity glowing in the cracks. Still, the toll was immense. Hands permanently rough from lye, backs bent from endless lifting, lungs blackened by coal smoke. And the emotional toll was just as heavy. Servants lived in the house but weren't part of it, forever outsiders in someone else's home, forever reminded of the line between upstairs and downstairs. You weren't a guest, you weren't even family, you were furniture with a pulse. Let's put this in modern terms. Imagine working a job where you had no weekend, no minimum wage, no HR department, and your boss not only lived with you, but could barge into your room at any moment and criticize your pillowcase. That was the reality of the scullery maid. And unlike a bad job today, you couldn't just quit and go work at Starbucks. For most, this was the only option between servitude and starvation. And here's the irony. While the scullery maid scrubbed away in obscurity, her labor was literally what made the glitter upstairs possible. Without her, no dishes sparkled, no ballroom glowed, no feasts dazzled. She was the foundation of the illusion, the reason the Vanderbilts could brag about their palaces while never touching a broom themselves. She was invisible, yes, but indispensable. It's tempting to imagine her being bitter, but many of these women developed a quiet, stoic strength. They endured because they had to, because survival required it. Some even climbed the ladder, scullery maid to kitchen maid to cook, if they had stamina and luck. Others squirreled away small wages, sending coins home to their families. Dreams were small but sharp, a dowry, a tiny shop, maybe even freedom. And that's the paradox of the Gilded Age. The glitter of the elite rested on the exhaustion of the unseen. Every diamond necklace upstairs was mirrored by calloused hands downstairs. Every chandelier was lit by someone who hadn't seen the sun in weeks. So the next time you picture a Vanderbilt ball or an Astor banquet, remember the girl in the attic. She was there too. You just weren't meant to see her. If the Gilded Age mansion was a corporation, the housekeeper was its CEO. Except she didn't get stock options. Her office was a drafty back room, and instead of a sleek Mercedes, she drove herself into exhaustion every single day. She was the one who made sure the illusion of effortless wealth never cracked. The chandeliers sparkled. That was her inspection. The drapes hung evenly. She checked the tassels twice. The mistress's nerves were soothed because the silver glinted just so. You could thank or blame the housekeeper. She didn't waltz through society balls in gowns of satin. She didn't sip champagne under the glow of Edison's newest invention. But make no mistake, she ran the show. Her mornings began early, long before the first family member stirred from their silk sheets. She made rounds like a general inspecting her troops. Except her troops were maids, footmen, and scullery girls half asleep with soot still under their fingernails. A fire out of place, a smudge on the banister, a wrinkle in the mistress's pillowcase. The housekeeper noticed, catalogued, and corrected. Perfection wasn't negotiable. She occupied a peculiar space in the household hierarchy. To the servants below, she was the enforcer, stern, precise, sometimes feared. To the mistress above, she was a shadowy figure of deference, all "yes, ma'am" and "at once, ma'am," while secretly managing every crisis so the lady of the house never had to hear about. Imagine being sandwiched between an impossible boss and a restless staff. It was middle management before middle management existed. The pressure was relentless. If a guest arrived and the silver hadn't been polished to a blinding gleam, it was her failure. If the footman tripped during service, her oversight. If the scullery maid sobbed into the potatoes because she hadn't slept in 3 days, that wasn't her problem. But it somehow became her responsibility anyway. She kept the gears turning, ensuring the mansion's grand illusion of effortless perfection stayed intact. Her personal life, non-existent. She lived inside the house, tethered to it by duty and expectation. Privacy was a joke. Weekends? Forget them. Days off? Rare. Romance? Maybe a flirtation whispered with a butler, but hardly the stuff of novels. If she had family, they lived elsewhere. Her family now was the household, and it wasn't exactly warm and cuddly. And yet, the housekeeper wielded an odd sort of power. She controlled who got hired and who got fired. She allocated assignments, decided who scrubbed chamber pots, and who graduated to polishing banisters. She could make life a little easier, or much, much harder, for the staff under her. Some housekeepers earned respect as stern but fair. Others became notorious tyrants, remembered decades later in the bitter stories of former scullery. Think of her as the mum friend of the entire mansion, except nobody ever thanked her, and half the time, someone was plotting to. If the Gilded Age ball was a Broadway show, she was the stage manager, headset glued to her, making sure the velvet curtains rose on cue while the audience swooned. The paradox of her role was loneliness. Too elevated to gossip with the maids, too subordinate to confide in the mistress. She lived in a liminal space, respected but isolated. Nights often ended with her pacing the halls, candle in hand, checking locks, smoothing wrinkles, making sure the illusion of wealth didn't collapse overnight. She was the ghost of the household, visible everywhere, truly seen by no one. If the housekeeper was the CEO, the butler was the brand ambassador, the human embodiment of the family's wealth. He was the gleaming silver tray, the polished shoe, the raised eyebrow that said, "Yes, we are richer than you." Picture him, tall, immaculate in black tailcoat, every hair in place, every movement precise. He wasn't allowed to sweat, or at least not to show it. When guests arrived, he was the one who opened the door with an expression of eternal calm. Behind that mask, a man running on equal parts discipline, dread, and possibly indigestion from too much cold beef. The butler's day revolved around display, polishing silver until it reflected like mirrors, decanting wine with the precision of a chemist, orchestrating meals so that no guest ever had to wait for a refill of champagne. He was master of ceremonies at every dinner, conductor of the table's symphony of clinking glasses and well-timed courses. If a fork was placed an inch off, or the roast came in lukewarm, the butler's reputation took the blow. He was, in effect, the family's social LinkedIn profile, projecting sophistication to every guest who walked through the mansion's towering doors. The family themselves could be dull, cruel, or uncouth, but with a butler like him, nobody had to know. His relationship with the master of the house was delicate. The two often developed a wordless understanding. A raised eyebrow meant, "Bring the port." A sigh meant, "Remove the bore talking about railroads." It was a dance of subtle signals, rehearsed through years of service. To outsiders, the butler appeared in control. To insiders, he was another servant, albeit one with a better suit. The cost of this performance was heavy. He had no personal freedom, no real identity beyond his role. His life was dictated by the family's schedule. If dinner lasted until 2 in the morning, so did he. If a surprise guest arrived at dawn, he was already dressed. Imagine living your entire life as an app constantly running in the background, waiting to be summoned by the ring of a bell. And though the butler projected authority, he too was lonely, too exalted to joke with the footman, too lowly to dine with the family. His existence was a tightrope walk, respected yet separate, dignified yet unseen. Still, there was a strange kind of pride in his role. The butler represented centuries of tradition, an unbroken line of service stretching back to English manners and French chateaux. He carried himself like nobility because, in the hierarchy of servants, he almost was. His gloves, his posture, his voice, all carefully curated to suggest that the family he served was not just rich, but properly grand. If you want a modern comparison, think of him as the public relations manager of the household. He crafted the image, managed the brand, and absorbed the stress, all while pretending it was effortless. And while he was respected, he also lived in the strangest of paradoxes. He was the most visible servant, yet his personality was supposed to be invisible. At night, when the house finally went quiet, the butler was still there, checking locks, storing the silver, preparing for tomorrow's charade. Like the housekeeper, he was indispensable to the grand illusion. Together, they made sure the Vanderbilt mansion, or any mansion, never cracked under the weight of its own absurdity. If the housekeeper was the brain and the butler was the face, then the cook was the heart, though one that pumped grease, steam, and the occasional shriek when a pot boiled over. The Gilded Age kitchen wasn't some charming, rustic place with copper pans and a friendly bustle. It was a battlefield, and the cook was its general. She presided over cauldrons the size of bathtubs, ovens that belched heat like small volcanoes, and a staff of kitchen maids who scrambled to keep up. She knew how to time a soufflé down to the second, how to stretch a haunch of venison across 3 courses, and how to manage both a budget and a mistress who insisted the menu simply must impress the Astors. Her day began long before anyone else's. Bread needed kneading, soups needed simmering, meat had to be seasoned and skewered. By the time the household stirred, the cook was already sweating like a coal miner, and unlike the shimmering ladies in the ballroom above, no pearls adorned her. Her jewelry was the burn scars dotting her hands, proof of years spent sacrificing skin to boiling broth and snapping flames. The irony, while she was feeding the wealthiest family in New York, her own meals were simple, scraps eaten standing over the counter, or a hasty bowl of stew after midnight. She tasted the most exquisite foods, but rarely sat to enjoy them. Imagine being a Michelin star chef whose restaurant only ever fed one client, and you weren't allowed to Instagram the results. And then there was the pressure. A Gilded Age dinner wasn't a meal, it was theatre. 6 courses, That was casual. 12 courses with sorbet served between the fish and the roast? Now you were talking. Guests expected exotic spices imported from the Orient, lobsters hauled in from Maine, wines from France. For the cook, every dinner was an exam, and failure meant humiliation in front of hundreds of glittering eyes. Burn one sauce, and you'd never hear the end of it. Her relationship with the mistress of the house was complicated. On paper, the mistress gave the orders. In reality, the cook held the knives, the recipes, and the power to ruin a party with one undercooked pheasant. They danced a constant tango of passive-aggressive requests and begrudging respect. The mistress might sniff, the soup was a touch salty, and the cook would smile while quietly muttering, "And your taste is a touch useless." And yet, for all her invisible labor, the cook was respected, even feared. She was the only servant who could shout orders at the others without consequence. A butler could be dignified, a housekeeper stern, but a cook could roar like a lion and still keep her position. Because at the end of the day, no one wanted to face an angry society guest with an empty plate. But her life was lonely too. She worked in the sweltering bowels of the house, often unseen by the family she served. She went to bed with her hair smelling of grease and woke to do it all again. In some ways, she was like the engine of a luxury train, essential, powerful, but hidden behind iron doors, never acknowledged by the passengers sipping champagne in the dining car. Now, while the cook ruled the kitchen like a queen in an apron, the lady's maid existed in a very different kingdom, one of mirrors, hairpins, and whispered secrets. The lady's maid was the private confidant of the mistress, but without the luxury of actually being her friend. Think of her as part stylist, part therapist, part spy. She knew every inch of her mistress's wardrobe, every tantrum before a ball, every whispered flirtation that could ruin a marriage. Her job was to craft the flawless image society demanded, her own identity, non-existent. Her mornings began by rousing her mistress. Gently, of course, because no wealthy woman wanted to be reminded she was just as cranky as the rest of us when woken before coffee. Then came the ritual, the bath prepared to the exact temperature, the hair arranged in elaborate styles that defied gravity, the corset laced tight enough to test lung capacity. If the lady emerged looking like an ethereal goddess, it was the maid's victory. If she looked merely mortal, it was the maid's failure. The pressure was absurd. Imagine doing hair and makeup every single day as if your client were about to walk the Met Gala red carpet, and then knowing that one crooked curl could be the difference between compliments and catastrophe. Trembling fingers weren't allowed. Neither were sighs of exasperation. Discretion was the unspoken rule. A lady's maid knew everything. Affairs, arguments, illnesses, indiscretions. But she carried those secrets like stones in her pockets, weighted down by knowledge she could never share. She lived in a liminal space, always present, never acknowledged. Guests never asked her name, but they certainly judged her mistress's gown, which was entirely her handiwork. Her own life, subsumed. She had no privacy, no true downtime. She slept in a tiny room near her mistress, always on call. If the mistress had a headache at midnight or a hem came loose at dawn, the maid was summoned. Imagine being on a permanent Find My iPhone alert. You could be pinged at any moment, and you had to show up. Still, there was a strange intimacy to her role. She was the only one allowed into the private sanctum of the lady's life, the dressing room. She witnessed vulnerability no one else saw. Tears shed when jewels were removed, exhaustion masked by powder, fears whispered in between fittings. And though she was invisible to the world, she often became the mirror in which her mistress measured herself. The loneliness of the position was profound. Too close to the family to be just staff, too much a servant to ever be an equal. She was like a shadow, always present, never independent. If you want a modern comparison, imagine being a personal assistant to a celebrity who pays you to manage their image, guard their secrets, and anticipate their every whim. But instead of a paycheck with commas, you got a small wage and a tiny bed in the attic. And yet, some ladies' maids took pride in their artistry. They became masters of fabric, hair, and cosmetic. Their skill might never have earned them fame, but it did earn them a strange kind of power, the ability to transform their mistress into a vision. And in an age where appearances mattered more than almost anything else, that power was priceless, even if the woman wielding it never reaped the rewards. If the lady's maid was the sculptor of femininity, the valet was the engineer of masculinity. He was the man behind the man, the figure who ensured the master appeared every bit the polished titan of the Gilded Age, even if that titan was, in truth, a sweaty, snoring bundle of flaws. A valet's job was deceptively simple on paper: dress the master, keep his clothes immaculate, maintain his grooming, and stand ready with the kind of discretion that could keep an entire reputation afloat. In reality, the valet was equal parts butler, barber, tailor, therapist, and occasionally accomplice. His day began before the master's eyes even opened. The shaving water had to be heated to the perfect temperature, warm enough to soften whiskers, not so hot that it scalded delicate aristocratic cheeks. The clothes were chosen with care, not just what looked good, but what would send the right message at breakfast, at the boardroom, or at the club. Want to look commanding at the bank meeting. Dark suit, sharp crease. Want to suggest ease, while still signaling superiority at a weekend in Newport. Cream linen, fresh cravat, pocket watch glinting in the sun. The valet's hands told the story. He could press a suit so flawlessly that it looked like it had never known a wrinkle. He could polish boots until you could practically see your reflection in them. And while the master might strut into a ball as if he'd been born naturally radiant, it was the valet who had stayed up the night before, stitching a ripped seam or de-staining an errant splash of brandy. But let's be honest, this wasn't just about clothes. It was about illusion. A valet made sure the master never looked like a man who sweated through his undershirt, who forgot to clip his nails, who occasionally ate too much steak and fell asleep in the library. Instead, he became a walking portrait of elegance, the perfect gentleman, as carefully constructed as a marble statue, just with less dusting. And, oh, the secrets the valet carried. He was the custodian of the master's vices, the flask tucked into a coat pocket, the lipstick smudge brushed off a collar, the gambling debts whispered about but never admitted in polite society. In many ways, the valet knew his employer more intimately than the employer's wife. After all, who else saw him naked, tired, drunk, and unguarded on a daily basis? It was an intimacy without affection, professional, clinical, yet profoundly close. The irony was that, for all his quiet authority, the valet erased himself completely. He dressed like a shadow. His voice was soft, his presence designed to vanish the moment the master stepped into the room. Imagine being the world's greatest stagehand. You rigged the lights, painted the sets, rehearsed the cues, but the actor got the ovation. Still, the position had prestige. To be a valet to a wealthy man was an honor of sorts. It came with a better wage, a bit of respect, and sometimes the chance to travel the world. You might accompany your master to Paris for fittings or to Newport for a summer ball. You might, in rare cases, even inherit hand-me-downs, suits too fine for a servant to wear anywhere but too worn for a master to keep. But like so many Gilded Age roles, the valet's life was lonely, too intimate with the master to fit in with the other servants, too much a servant to ever be an equal. He existed in a strange no man's, defined by his employer's reflection rather than his own reality. If you want a modern metaphor, imagine being the personal stylist, barber, and bodyguard to a billionaire CEO. You knew his every insecurity and were responsible for making him look like the alpha male he believed himself to be. Only, instead of a six-figure salary, you got a cot in the attic and the occasional hand-me-down waistcoat. And yet, in his own way, the valet was indispensable. Strip away the glamour of the Gilded Age, and you still had a man who couldn't tie his own cravat. The valet was the invisible scaffolding holding up the image of power. Without him, the master was just another man fumbling with buttons. If the butler was the conductor and the valet was the stagehand, then the footman was, let's be blunt, the human prop. His job was to be seen, to stand tall, look impressive, and remind every guest who stepped across the threshold. This family is rich enough to hire a man just to stand there holding a tray of wine and looking decorative. It sounds cruel, but that was the point. In the rigid hierarchy of the Gilded Age household, the footman's role wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. A butler could be useful, a cook kept people alive, a scullery maid at least scrubbed something clean. But a footman? He was the ornamental candelabra of the domestic world. He existed to shine. Now, that doesn't mean he did nothing. His daily list of chores could be grueling, carrying coal to the fireplaces, polishing brass until it gleamed like gold, hauling heavy trays of food up endless staircases. And he was always at risk of embarrassment, drop a fork at dinner, stumble while serving soup, or cough during grace, and you could be scolded as though you had ruined the family name itself. But beyond these tasks, the footman's true function was visual impact. Guests didn't just see wealth in the marble staircase or the gilded mirrors. They saw it in the rows of liveried men silently flanking the dining room. The taller and more handsome the footman, the better. Families would sometimes compete to hire the best-looking staff, because appearances weren't just superficial, they were currency. A footman with broad shoulders and a noble profile was, in a sense, another piece of furniture, but one that could glare disapprovingly at your less fashionable cousin while handing him a roll. In some households, height was literally measured during interview. 6 feet tall? Perfect. Strong arms? Even better. Good cheekbones? Hired. Imagine being rejected for a job because you were only 5'8". It happened. You were expected to be part athlete, part model, and part mute servant. And mute was the key word. Unlike the butler, who could speak with a certain gravitas, or the housekeeper, who might bark orders, the footman had no lines. He was like an extra in a movie who spent decades in the same role. His job was to stand, wait, and obey. Never offer an opinion, never speak out of turn. He was a body, a presence, a uniform. The loneliness of it was profound. Too grand to mingle with the lower staff, not respected enough to share the butler's authority. The footman existed in a sort of decorative limbo. His life was formal, distant, and often joyless. He was both visible and invisible at once, noticed for his posture, ignored for his humanity. The irony? Many footmen were young men from poor backgrounds who had dreamed of escaping manual labor. They thought this position might offer prestige. Instead, they discovered that their muscles were used for carrying trays. Their youth was exploited for standing upright for hours, and their silence was bought cheaply with wages that barely covered a new pair of shoes. And yet, for the family, the footman was worth every penny. Because nothing screamed, "We are obscenely wealthy," quite like having someone whose entire career revolved around handing you a napkin at the right angle. Think of it like today's influencers, who pay personal assistants just to take photos of them holding lattes in perfect lighting. The servant may be exhausted, but to the world, the illusion looks flawless. So, when you picture the grandeur of a Vanderbilt dinner party, don't just imagine the crystal chandeliers or the 40-course meals. Picture the silent line of footmen, stiff-backed and stone-faced, waiting with trays, trained to move in perfect synchronization, like human wallpaper with impeccable posture. Because in the theatre of the Gilded Age household, they weren't the stars. They weren't even supporting actors. They were the set dressing. If the footman was ornamental wallpaper, the hallboy was the broom shoved in the corner, essential, invisible, and always in motion. Usually no older than 12 or 13, the hallboy was the lowest of the low, the very bottom rung of the household ladder. He was not so much an employee as an experiment. Let's see if this boy survives long enough to become a manservant. His day began earlier than everyone else and ended later too. If the butler rose at 6, the hall boy was already shuffling coal by 5. If the scullery maid was up to her elbows in suds, the hall boy was running up and down staircases with hot water jugs until his legs burned. He answered every bell in the house. Literally. Wealthy Gilded Age homes were wired with bell systems, each little chime demanding instant service. Imagine being an unpaid Uber Eats runner, except instead of lattes you were delivering polished boots or a forgotten hairbrush. And instead of tips, you got yelled at for breathing too loudly in the hallway. The name Hall Boy came from his post. He hovered in the hallways, always on standby. His tasks included polishing shoes until they gleamed, carrying endless coal scuttles to keep fireplaces roaring, cleaning boots caked in city muck, running errands through the streets, and generally being treated as if he were a walking mop. His uniform, usually hand-me-down livery that never quite fit, sleeves too long, trousers too short, a collar that itched. He looked perpetually like someone's younger cousin forced into last year's Christmas outfit. And because he was a child, mistakes were inevitable. Drop a bucket, spill a tray, or show up 2 minutes late, and the reprimand could be harsh. Older servants often bullied the hall boy, half to train him, and half because, well, someone had to absorb the frustrations of the household pecking order. He was a punching bag in both the literal and metaphorical sense. Loneliness clung to him like soot. Far from his own family, too young to drink with the footmen, too poor to earn respect from anyone, the hall boy lived in a kind of suspended childhood. He slept in the worst rooms, sometimes in the basement, sometimes in an attic corner, and his dreams, if he had any energy left to dream, were often about escape. And yet, there was one shimmering promise dangling ahead: promotion. If he worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, and didn't collapse from exhaustion, he might one day climb the ranks to footman, maybe even butler. That hope was what kept many of these boys shuffling coal in the dead of night. The thought that their labor wasn't just servitude, but apprenticeship. Still, let's not sugarcoat it. This was child labor at its rawest. These were kids who should have been in school, learning algebra or poetry, but instead were learning how to balance a coal scuttle on one hip while dodging an angry cook. If you think your teenage years were hard because you had to work a summer job at McDonald's, picture scrubbing soot off a fireplace for 16 hours, only to be sent out in the rain to fetch more kindling. The hall boy was both tragic and strangely heroic, the cog that kept the machine running, the unseen figure behind the glitter of the dining room. Without him, the house would literally go cold and dark. With him, everything sparkled, except his own life, which remained grim, soot-stained, and overlooked. In the end, the hall boy symbolized the human cost of Gilded Age grandeur. Every chandelier gleaming over a banquet table, every polished shoe tapping on marble floors, every roaring fire in a mansion's hearth. Somewhere, there was a small exhausted boy who had made it possible, and who would likely never get to sit at the table he served. Now, after trudging through scullery grime, coal dust, and emotional exhaustion, you might be wondering, why on earth would anyone choose this life? Because believe it or not, there actually were upside, tiny ones. Think crumbs of comfort scattered across an otherwise exhausting banquet. And yet, for many servants in the Gilded Age, those crumbs were enough to keep them going. The first upside was simple: certainty. A job in service meant a roof over your head, 3 meals a day, well, 2.5, depending on how you counted bread and dripping as breakfast, and the faint promise of wages at the end of the week. Compared to the chaos of unemployment in crowded immigrant districts or the lethal gamble of factory, servitude was, dare we say it, the safer option. Yes, your body ached, your boss might scream at you for dust on a vase, but at least you weren't losing fingers in a textile mill or starving in a tenement cellar. It was survival with structure. Another upside: promotion was technically possible. A hall boy who learned the rhythms of the household might climb the ladder to footman, and if he survived long enough without collapsing, maybe butler. A scullery maid could become a kitchen maid, then perhaps even assistant to the cook, with the faint glimmer of authority. This career ladder was less an escalator and more like climbing a greased pole. But it existed, and for many young servants, that fragile hope was a lifeline. And then there was camaraderie. You might hate your boss, but you loved your fellow sufferer. Servants shared gossip in the kitchen, whispered jokes in the scullery, even snuck bits of food from lavish dinners to taste behind closed doors. The grand house was its own ecosystem, and the staff formed a surrogate family. Dysfunctional, yes, but one bound together by endurance. A maid who comforted you when you were homesick, a footman who winked when the mistress scolded you. These tiny acts of solidarity stitched sanity back into the day. There were also unexpected perks of proximity. Working in the home of the wealthy gave servants front row seats to a different world. Art on the walls, music from hired quartets, the scent of imported perfume, the sight of Paris gowns sweeping down staircases. You weren't part of that world, but you could observe it, even learn from it. Many servants picked up refined manners, snippets of foreign languages, and knowledge of etiquette that later helped them in other jobs, or in marrying slightly upward. Think of it as the original LinkedIn networking, except instead of contacts you collected crumbs of cultural capital. And let's not forget about practical education. Servants became experts in cleaning, sewing, grooming, cooking, even basic medicine. A lady's maid might learn how to stitch up a hem in seconds, apply cosmetics like an artist, or arrange hair like an architect. A butler became a master of logistics, hospitality, and personnel management. These weren't hobbies, they were transferable skills that, with luck, could launch new careers, running boarding houses, opening restaurants, or becoming respected artisans. Still, it's important not to romanticize these upsides. They were survival strategies more than luxury. To call them perks is like saying modern office workers should feel grateful for free coffee pods while working 80-hour weeks. But in the hierarchy of the Gilded Age, a little food security, a bit of camaraderie, and the faint chance of promotion were enough to keep people tethered to this world. And perhaps the greatest upside of all was this: purpose. However invisible they were, servants knew they mattered. The wealthy couldn't live their glittering lives without them. Every banquet depended on the cook's skill. Every polished chandelier depended on the hall boy's aching arm. Every party dress depended on the maid's fingers. Servants weren't celebrated, but they were indispensable. That quiet sense of being necessary, of being the hidden machinery that made the machine run, was, for many, its own form of dignity. So yes, the upsides were modest, but they were real. And for every young immigrant stepping off a ship at Ellis Island, or every farmhand desperate for work in the city, the promise of 3 meals, a roof, and a chance to climb just one rung higher was enough to lure them into the cavernous household of the Gilded Age. For every crumb of comfort in a Gilded Age servant's life, there was a loaf of misery baked right beside it. The downsides weren't just inconvenient, they were baked to the very structure of service. The first and most obvious was time. Servants didn't really own any. If the mistress wanted hot chocolate at midnight, or the master misplaced his cufflinks at dawn, the staff was expected to leap up like caffeinated rabbits. Days stretched into 12, 14, even 16 hours, broken only by the rare half-day off. Imagine being on call forever, except there's no smartphone to silence, just a bell that rings from the dining room wall until you appear, panting and apologetic. Then there was the loss of self. Servants were expected to erase their individuality, becoming extensions of the household they served. A lady's maid didn't have her own style. She mirrored her mistress. A butler didn't have mood. He was a calm mask in human form. Even laughter could be risky if it was overheard at the wrong time. In a way, they were the original ghost employee, present, crucial, but never meant to draw attention. The physical toll was punishing. Scrubbing, lifting, carrying, bending, all of it left hands raw, backs sore, and bodies aged before their time. And unlike their wealthy employers, there were no spa retreats or summer holidays in Newport to recover. A servant's only wellness plan was to keep working until collapse. And perhaps worst of all was the social stigma. Servants might live inside palaces, but they were still outsiders, constantly reminded of their inferiority. Wealthy families could treat them with kindness, yes, but also with contempt. To many employers, staff were invisible until something went wrong, and then they were all too visible. It was the Gilded Age version of being blamed when the Wi-Fi goes out. No one cares when it works. Everyone yells when it doesn't. So while the job offered survival and the faint shimmer of upward mobility, it also meant sacrificing freedom, privacy, and dignity. For every banquet that dazzled society, there was a servant hidden in the shadows, exhausted, anonymous, and expendable. The Gilded Age is remembered for its robber barons, its mansions, and its glittering soirees. But underneath the chandeliers, it was the servants who kept the candles burning. Their lives were quiet, grueling, and mostly invisible, yet they formed the foundation that allowed the elite to shine so brightly. Domestic service became the largest employer of women in America by the late 19th century. For newly arrived immigrants, Irish, German, Scandinavian, later Italian and Eastern European, it was often the only option. Entire families relied on the wages of daughters who polished silver and scrubbed marble floors in someone else's home. The irony was rich. The very people who were mocked as low class were the ones preserving the high gloss of the upper class. The legacy of this world lingers in more ways than we realize. The language of service, discretion, loyalty, efficiency seeped into modern workplaces. The divide between those who manage and those who serve didn't vanish. It simply changed uniform. And the broader lesson that dazzling wealth is often propped up by unseen labor is one that echoes right into today. Swap the gilded mansions for glass skyscrapers, and the butlers for gig workers delivering groceries, and the pattern looks awfully familiar. Even the homes themselves remind us. Places like the Breakers in Newport or the Biltmore in North Carolina, now open to tourists, tell two stories at once. On the surface, they're monuments to luxury, but behind the ropes and velvet curtain, you can still find the cramped servant quarter, narrow stairways, and cool bells, faint reminders of the hidden machinery of the Gilded Age. The legacy isn't just wealth or grandeur, it's inequality, resilience, and the eternal tug-of-war between those who feast and those who serve. And so, when we look back on the Gilded Age, with its millionaires in diamond tiaras and its scullery maids with raw hands, we see not just a moment in history, but a mirror, a world where wealth reached dizzying heights, while poverty clung to survival in the shadows. The contrast between rich and poor wasn't an accident, it was the very engine of the age. The Vanderbilts couldn't have their balls without someone sweeping up after them. The Astors couldn't glitter without coal dust staining a hall boy's fingers. And while the Gilded Age eventually faded, its questions never did. Who gets the gold, and who pays the price? So, as you close your eyes tonight, remember, history isn't just about palaces and fortune. It's also about the quiet strength of those who endured, who kept the fires lit, who carried trays through the silence, who lived in the shadows of chandeliers. If you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, let this story carry you into sleep. And if you're still awake at the end, well, I'll be here to say goodnight. Written by Clara Finch.